Rangitirama, talofa lava, and greetings to each of you on behalf of Te Kāhui, Tika Tangata, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and also commissioners who are present here today. Also, ko Andre Afamasaga tōku ingoa. My name is Andre Afamasaga, and I'll be your panel facilitator today. I welcome you all to our webinar teams, Hui, Zui, or Zonal today on the topic Conversion Practices in Aotearoa, Developing a Holistic Response to Spiritual Abuse, a research by Dr. Michael Roguski, and also Nicola Atwell. Thank you for taking time out from your lunch and your day to join us. And from wherever you are, we acknowledge not only you and your loved ones, but also mana whenua on the places and lands we meet. And by the way, can I just say, you're all looking mighty good today. I'm joking, I can't see you, but I can absolutely sense the positive vibes coming from all of you today. On that note, given the heavy and important nature of our kaupapa, we're going to open our space today with some whakatauki or proverbs so we can be reminded of the wisdom and the spirit and the purpose that has led us here and will also underpin our time together today. I'll hand over to Hera Clarke, who will shortly be introduced alongside our other panelists, but before then has kindly agreed to share this whakatauki with us. Tēnā koe, Hera. Just on mute.
E hara taku toa I te toa taka ki tini tahi. Engari he toa taki tini, which acknowledges one's success due to the contributions of many. As it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a community to enable an individual's success. Ko tāu raurau, ko tāku raurau, ka ora ai te iwi, with your basket of knowledge and my basket of knowledge, together our people will thrive. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe. Kia ora, Hera, for those beautiful whakatauki this morning. Before our panelists are introduced, I'll do some important housekeeping. On the screen, you will see one of our two NZSL interpreters. We have Taryn Banks and then also Bridie Strang, who will join in later as well. We also wish to issue a content warning. The discussion here today will include sensitive issues, so please reach out if you need support. For example, you could call Outline Aotearoa or the Need to Talk service on 1737. Throughout our webinar today, cameras and mics are set as off for the audience, and the discussion is being recorded for sharing later as well. And you can ask questions throughout the chat today in the queue, as we will be having a Q&A section at the end with our panelists as well. And the report being discussed today is already on the Commission's website, and the link available in the slide at the end and also in your invitations today. So without further delay, it's my privilege today to acknowledge and allow each of our panelists to introduce themselves today. I'll quickly mention their names and their titles, and then we'll go over to them to introduce themselves in the way they feel comfortable. We have Dr. Michael Roguski, who is the Director of Kaitiaki Research and Evaluation, and also wants to acknowledge as well the contribution to the writing of that report also of Nicola Atwell also. We also have Hera Clarke, who's the Commissary for Reconciliation and Restoration for the Anglican Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also Polynesia. And we have Matt Langworthy, who's the former manager of the Conversion Practices Response Service and also has lived experience of conversion practices. And I'll introduce myself after we go around the team. So we'll start off with you, Michael, followed by Hera and Matt.
Kia ora, Andre. Kia ora koutou. Ko Mikari Roguski ho, ko Aotearoa tūwharitona iwi, ko kai whakahaere, Kaitiaki Research and Evaluation. I'm a academic, but also have my own research company, which is Kaitiaki. We specialize in sensitive topic research, which is include from the gambit of human rights and justices in prison, to our sex worker communities, to takatapui, to refugee and migrants. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou, ko Matt Langworthy tōko ingoa. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Andre said, I was the manager of the Commission's Conversion Practices Implementation team, and my background is in change and implementation programs of work in the public health, human rights and dispute resolution space. I also bring to this work my over 20 years of lived experience of faith-based conversion practices. Thanks again for joining.
Tēnā tātou katoa, ko Hera Clarke hau, he uri no te aupori, ngā puhi, Ngāti Porou. My role as the Commissary for Reconciliation and Restoration within the Anglican Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. I want to, by way of introduction to this faith-based church, read parts of the submission on conversion practices prohibition legislation bill, which was presented by our two archbishops of the Anglican Church, Archbishop Don Tamihere and Archbishop Philip Richardson. It reads, ko te hua ia o te wairua, he aroha, he hari, he rangi mārie, he manawa nui, he ngāwari, he ngākau pai, he whakapono, he ngākau māhaki, he ngākau kua taia te pē. Ka hore he ture e riria ai e nei mea. In summary, the archbishops of Aotearoa, New Zealand Church write, we believe that human sexuality is a gift of God to be cherished and honoured. It is an intrinsic part of who we are as human beings and an expression of God's glorious diversity in creation. Anything which seeks to suggest that there is something inherently wrong or sinful in those who are takatapuhi and LGBTQI+, or who seeks to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression is, we believe, wrong. We acknowledge with sadness that certain religious teachings have often caused and continue to cause deep pain and offence to takatapui and LGBTQI+ New Zealanders. We acknowledge with profound regret that some of these teachings have created and continue to create oppressive systems that fuel intolerance, perpetuate injustice, and result in violence and abuse. We ask forgiveness for those whose lives have been damaged and destroyed on the pretext of religious teachings. I want to open my contribution as the faith-based representative here today to echo the submission by the hierarchy of the Anglican Church, and indeed, I'm sure, is supported by other faiths, and I think particularly Salvation Army, the Methodist Church, and many others. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koe. Thank you, Hera. You will hear those sounds in the background. Those are the sounds of the city, there Te Whanganui Tara, where our three panelists join us from, and I'm joining you from Ngā Motu New Plymouth in Taranaki today. My name is Andre Afamasaga. As I've said before, I'm today's facilitator, and alongside Matt, I worked at the Human Rights Commission. I was there for 5 years, including being the GM of the Advice, Research and Engagement team, which also had oversight of the establishment of the Conversion Practices Response. And also, like Matt, I have lived experience of conversion practices. I was in those harmful practices, which we'll hear more about today, for 15 years. And also, as well, I'm an ex-model and an ex-pastor. I'm just kidding about the model. I'm an ex-pastor there as well. When Matt and I, both survivors of conversion practices and also having lived experience of growing up in religious settings and homes and families, we knew that when we had the privilege to lead the implementation of the Human Rights Commission's conversion practices response in response to the conversion practices prohibition legislation in 2022, we knew it needed to be survivor-centred, trauma-informed and nuanced. And the Commission was also very clear about that being also what they were committed to. And that meant that our response needed to be really nuanced, and it needed to also provide not just stating where harm existed, but also giving practical, pragmatic, and realistic ways to actually help people out of these harms. And so that's been done by various guidance that is available today on the Commission's website, and also led to the commissioning of the research that we will be discussing today. The Commission's hope in this research being published in our webinar today is to validate and support survivors by sharing their experiences of these practices and also their recommendations as well. The Commission also wishes, alongside survivors as well, to raise awareness of what conversion practices looks like. And I'm really pleased to say that the research we'll hear today offers unique new contributions to the literature of conversion practices, because it is one that is based in New Zealand and based on survivor experiences in Aotearoa. And we'll hear some new framing from Michael and others as well. And also to highlight the support mechanisms that are currently in place via the Commission, via services like Outline, the Polynesia Network, but also a discussion of the support mechanisms that are needed for the future as well. And the panelists today will be talking. We'll start off with Michael, Dr. Roguski, who's going to share with us a summary of the research. And then Matt, as a survivor, will share his insights as well as some call to actions from his lived experience as a survivor on behalf of other survivors also. And then we'll again hear from Hera this morning, who will share her important role that she plays not only within the Anglican Church, but her wider contribution to the role of religious and faith settings in response to conversion practices. So without further ado, we'll hand over to our first panelist today. And it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Dr. Michael, for a summary of the research that we're here today for. Thank you.
Kia ora, Andre. Now, hopefully you'll be able to see a PowerPoint slide come up on your thing. So before we begin, I just want to begin with some acknowledgements. There's a whole lot of people, which if you can see them, that have participated, contributed, supported this mahi. But above all, and I'll let you read those yourselves, but above all, we just want to, Nicola and I would really like to acknowledge our participants. It takes a great deal of courage to come forward and share our stories of pain. And we just really thank you for taking time to trust us, and the compassion, the insights you bring. This wouldn't be possible without you. Kia ora. Moving on. So, in terms of what we did, so as Andre, who was so eloquently said, the Commission contracted us to do this mahi. So based on previous research on conversion practices, which is generally in the literature, is to do with therapy, it's been a little bit different. Sometimes people have talked to, focused on formal conversion practices, informal, which is sort of the pressure to change through friends, family, loved ones. And more recently, people have talked about conversion ideology. Those are the sort of messages we get from the pulpit, those in authority. So what we did in designing this is that we wanted to make sure that each form of conversion practices was included. We set up this amazing advisory group who were acknowledged in the previous with names on the previous slide. And we recruited throughout March and June, and we did interviews. Participants, we just wanted to say we're given a choice of the type of interviewer that they most were resonated with. So there was non-heterosexual, gender diverse, and whether or not they were a survivor. For instance, well, I was the only survivor within the interview panel. So in total, 25 people were interviewed, 23 of whom were survivors of religious conversion practices, and 2 survivors of non-religious change efforts. And if you're relatively new to this area, that would include people, say, who are transgender, non-binary, who have been denied medical intervention. So it's a not religiously based form of a change effort, but it's medically based. So what we found, first of all, participants were very clear that please don't refer to this as simply harm. We need to elevate this to the level of spiritual abuse. They said this because, as we've found with similar forms of abuse, such as sexual abuse, family violence, and so forth, if something acknowledged as spiritual abuse, it is forced to be taken seriously. By referring to as simply harm, it has blurred the lines, really. And so, yes, survivors, our participants, were very, very clear. Let's elevate it to what it is. Next, survivors, they talked about difficulty identifying their experiences were commonly referred to as being trapped. So there are 3 forms of entrapment we've noted. And what's interesting about this is that this builds upon the type of entrapment that you might be familiar with through family violence literature. It diverges a bit, but it's still a form of entrapment. So first of all, there was spiritual entrapment. That's being trapped in environments that have that demand obedience, survivors surrendering choice in lieu of the faith authority, the settings authority over the individual. And any challenge to these dictates is met with accusations of mental illness, demon possession, or punishment. And I think this was really important because one of the barriers that participants said that they had when they were able to extricate themselves from these environments of harm is that they were often met with statements such as, well, what did you expect? That's what's meant to happen. So it's definitely statements that are not helpful, but to appreciate this as spiritual entrapment is vital. Next is social entrapment. And participants described having lived in cocooned existences that prevented them from engaging in developmental tasks that non-religious peers are more likely to go through. So that was like knowing how to find accommodation, how to rent accommodation, how to look for, engage in formal training outside of a faith-based environment, how to look for work. So they talked often about being delayed, a high degree of naivety. So once they were, social entrapment was about after they left the negative environment, these environments of harm, but they were still entrapped because they just had this huge degree of naivety, yeah. Then there's structural entrapment, and that's the indifference of institutions to a survivor's suffering. Specifically, participants talked about inadequate legislation. So we've come a long way. The legislation is great. It's a first step. But in terms of, say, ideological, the impact of ideology, conversion ideology, the legislation doesn't go there. The legislation doesn't address informal conversion practices where our loved ones, our friends, families, those within our faith communities try to effect change on us. Structural entrapment also came about because we in our life, there are some people that we can come across who may be able to provide us with the first indication of change, of hope or support. Participants talked about teachers, nurses, medical doctors, and sometimes mental health professionals. Sadly, very few of these named professions have insight into the type of pain that spiritual abuse results in. And so while these professions are not trained in terms of cult-like, the effects of cult-like behaviours and how to extricate, how to support in a mana-enhancing way, that is definitely forms a form of structural entrapment. The final thing that people talked about was there's an urgent need to develop a pipeline to safety. So it was interesting. The pipeline was a metaphor that was regularly employed by participants. So, and the pipeline, if we can imagine it, reaches into these environments of harm and into the future, acknowledging that people's healing goes beyond just being extricated, but it takes a long time to heal from the negative effects of spiritual abuse. To do this, participants strongly suggested that we need to create an agency to support spiritual abuse survivors. An agency should comprise of survivors and faith organisations. So some people might find that survivors are saying, we've got to walk alongside faith organisations, but this is really important, and it complements Hera's positioning. There are a number of faith organisations who are taking responsibility of the pain, the abuse of the past. They want to do things differently. They need, and they're willing to come together and work with survivors and trying to find a solution to these problems. Within this agency, government was seen as part of it, but definitely not the leader. It was government was seen to be walking alongside survivors and faith organisations. The biggest thing that needs to happen is that these parties need to develop a strategy to respond to each level of entrapment. So that includes while people are being still trapped in abusive environments. So, and it's really difficult. So some of these environments of harm are so close that it's very hard to reach into and to provide young people or people alternative forms of reality. But that's where a strategy is really vital. The strategy needs to include how to support people leaving the abusive environment. So what we found from participants is that you're leaving your family, your loved ones, your faith, so you don't have housing. The chances of having a job, having money, being able to eat is severely limited. And so there's an immediate need to provide support in terms of simple basic needs. There needs to be the strategy needs to include healing throughout the survivor's lifetime. That means provision of mental health and medical care, trauma-informed, survivor-informed care. And again, going back to the urgent need to develop our mental health professionals, our nurses, our doctors, having an awareness at least of the impact of cult-like behaviour. And finally, and this comes back to the compassion of our participants, there is a need to engage with faith organisations in dialogue in a way that provides a mana to combat the negative conversion ideologies that can come from a pulpit, to raise awareness for those who are still engaging in this, to acknowledge that people internalise this pain and they're at risk of suiciding. They're at risk of mental health crises, injury, and there's got to be a way, surely through dialogue, to be able to maintain one's faith, but to stop engaging in hate. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Dr. Michael Roguski. I have to say, Michael and I this week have been doing some media regarding this research report, and one of the interviews that I was in, I reflected that had this type of research and evidence been around when I was caught in the throes of conversion practices, I would have had the language to describe the harm that was occurring to me at the time, and I would have been able to exit those practices earlier. And as we've heard from Michael here today, that rather than this sort of catch-all term harm that sort of doesn't really fully describe the sharpness and the sharp end of what occurs to people, that this research offers some new framings as survivors have described, and those new framings are that conversion practices are a form of or tantamount to religious and spiritual abuse, and even go as far as saying that it is like cult-like behaviours occurring to them. And so I often reflect that this research, as is all good research, is also helping to give voice and language to those who are often voiceless, and sometimes due to the trauma and the severity of the harm that has been experienced, don't even find the words or the concept to describe what is occurring. So we just thank you so much, Michael, for your research in this space, as well as Nicola as well, and especially the survivors who contributed their voice and their insights to the research. On that note, we're going to go over to our friend Matt Langworthy, who is, if you're just joining us, also is a survivor of conversion practices themselves, and also helped the Commission's response. And Matt will reflect and respond to the research from his perspective now. Over to you, Matt. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Andre. And I did see that comment come through on the screen. So just clarifying, I'm here today in my capacity as an independent advocate for the human rights of queer people and for the ending of conversion practices. And Michael, who was speaking, was our lead researcher on this commissioned research project. So I really want to acknowledge Michael and Nicola and the team. This article is absolutely a meaningful and significant contribution to the international evidence base on conversion practices. And it is also a really excellent example of trauma-informed research, really sensitively and safely executed research with the lived experience community. And I think we need to pause and really acknowledge that and acknowledge the survivors that came forward to share their experiences. Thank you to them. Andre talked about the Commission's commitment when he and I were staff at the Commission leading this project. We wanted survivors to be centered and their voices to be heard. And the reason for that is because conversion practices, by their very nature, silence who a person is. They take away a person's agency and their autonomy and their voice. And so the Commission's work, and by extension, this research project, has been an act of restoration for survivors. It has been a commitment to reverse that and to provide a space for survivors' voices. Some of those really important voices throughout the Commission's work have been those of our trans and intersex whānau and of Māori, Pacific and ethnic community survivors of conversion practices. There are not enough stories shared yet from those communities, from that part of our whānau. And one of the things that we need to do in addition to this research is more work to find a greater variety of experiences and to publish their stories as well. And so I acknowledge Māori and Pacific ethnic community and trans and intersex whānau who might be here today and who might listen in the future. And I really encourage you to share your stories as well. One of the aspects of this research that I wanted to highlight is the way that it describes how there is a web, a sort of system that is the mechanism for this spiritual abuse. So when we hear the word abuse, we might have an image of a person harming another person. And while that is sometimes a part of conversion practices, what this research describes is the system when you are part of a community and it has a set of beliefs and you come under the indoctrination from that community. When you realize that you are someone who doesn't fit in with that community's norms, there begins a process of a form of coercion to fit in. And when you are part of our queer whānau, sometimes that takes the form, it escalates into conversion practices and it escalates into a form of entrapment within that community. And that is spiritual abuse. There are actors within our families and our social circles, within our faith circles, sometimes our extracurricular activities where we live and work. All of that forms a part of the web, the system that is the mechanism for the delivery of conversion practices. And understanding that is critical to understanding why we need the pipeline to support people out of conversion practices. This is complex and people become really stuck. And I particularly want to acknowledge our older generation survivors. The longer we stay in these settings, the more and more difficult it is to extract ourselves because so much of the system of our own life becomes a part of the entrapment. And to those people, I want to say, you are important. You are dear and valuable, and you too deserve well-being and voice and autonomy. And our hope is that this research adds to the evidence base and adds to the interventions that are available to bring you out of conversion practices. Another reason that the support mechanisms are so important is because when we finally manage to stop the conversion practices and step away from environments of abuse, there begins a whole new set of challenges. We have often had to break ties in order to step away, or at least there is significant disruption in our whānau or our work or our social circles. There's interruption to income and a number of the other things that Michael spoke about. They really serve as a new set of barriers that need to be overcome, in addition to having all of the baggage of the spiritual abuse on board still as well. And I hope that what this research does is paint a picture more explicitly of the cooperation that's needed between faith communities and government and society generally to support survivors to identify what they're going through, to move out of it, and to begin to build new mechanisms for well-being in their life, whatever it is that they might choose. I think that having read this, we cannot be silent. And for me personally, there are a number of calls to action that I think follow on from this research, follow on from what survivors have been saying and have said again in this project. And they're quite specific, my list of calls to action, and they start with the Commission's funding for this mahi. It's quite unusual for government to pass a law and create something and then not fund the ongoing work that must happen. And my call to action is for that funding to be reinstated so that we can form a part of this system, this pipeline that needs to be created. Clearly, the Act needs to be strengthened as well. And I think fundamentally the flaw in this Act, like some others, is that it puts all the burden and onus on the survivor community to raise up a complaint, to find the strength and the time and the courage to come forward. We are part of a society that offers great protection and privilege to faith communities. And what we need to do is hold them to better account when the spiritual abuse has been happening, not instead know that that's happening, let the privileges continue, and put the burden on survivors to come forward under this law. There are a number of specific other things that need to change apart from that fundamental basis, like removing the age gate within the Act, removing some of the barriers to accessing government support for survivors of abuse. I think faith groups must better grapple with their own history as well. There are many examples across the centuries of history in our faith groups of them having gotten something wrong and done a good job of eventually acknowledging that and reinterpreting, updating their interpretation of their sacred texts and moving on from eras when they were clearly in the wrong. And we are now at a crossroads where our faith communities need to do a better job of realizing that they have been wrong about our queer whānau. They belong in faith communities as well if they want them, if they want to be there. And they need to be supported, not just by a few members along the sideline of a faith community, but by the very leadership and the structure itself. And I echo the research's call for a system of support that is built on a foundation of cooperation, that is funded and that works to do these important few steps: intervene, support a person to step out, and then support a person to reestablish their life, however they might want that to be structured outside of conversion practices. The survivor community is a beautiful and rich and bright community, and I really want to finish by acknowledging again the strength of the people that have come forward. Thank you for your contribution. You are showing all of us, again, what we already know, which is that we survivors have been through a lot and we have a lot to offer. And I really am grateful to the Commission and to Kaitiaki Research for doing this work. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Matt. Mano lava for those really well expressed articulated comments from your perspective as a survivor. And as a survivor myself, I also know those views in which you share are held widely by the community, leading up to the Conversion Practices Prohibition Legislation Act and the Select Committee process that accompanied that. We heard from many survivors about the ongoing enduring harm of conversion practices upon themselves and other people, and noting as well that the effects of these practices for some people have been fatal as well. But what we also heard about in the Select Committee process, which is also reflected here in the research as well, is that the distinction between conversion practices as the legislation defines it and the ideologies that are pervasive and are causing harm, which might not meet the technical threshold as described in the legislation, are very widespread and are affecting people and cause many people to actually suppress or change or want to change their own gender identity or expression or sexual orientation. And I think what this research does is move away those sort of delineations between the formal conversion practices and ideologies to share about how widespread and enduring this harm is, therefore requiring systems of support. Some of the recommendations or some of the calls to action which Matt has raised there on behalf of himself and other survivors. Also a lovely segue in which I'll eventually talk about is a forthcoming report, the Conversion Practices Insights report that the Commission will soon release as well, that also shares some of these recommendations as well, but I'll get to that later. One of the things that Matt also talked about was the role of churches and faith groups as well. And we will be hearing from Hera shortly. Sometimes often in human rights conversations, these conversations can often be people talking at each other, and sometimes those groups aren't even in the same room. In Hera's introduction, did share an acknowledgement from her faith community about this type of reckoning that Matt was talking about that is occurring. And we've seen this happen in other faith spaces or religious groups around either decolonization, coming to terms with racism, coming to terms with gendered violence or whatever. And we've heard a bit of that from Hera today. So on that note, we're really privileged that Hera is also part of this discussion as well, and will share some of what she's seen, not only from her denomination, but from her vantage point in the church too. So over to you, Hera. Kia ora.
Tēnā tātou katoa. I absolutely echo Matt's sentiments and response to the report that Professor Michael Roguski has provided for us. And ka nui te mihi ki a koe, mō enei mahi rangatira, mō wai, mō mātou nei whānau, e noho pāpauri I raro I tēnei kaupapa. Nō reira, tēnā koe. I want to also just to introduce the role of the Commissary for the Anglican Church in reconciliation and restoration. Initially, my work in this space has been specifically following the Royal Commission inquiry into historical abuse, at which my role in the Anglican Church was really to listen to the voices of survivors. And as Michael identified earlier, the crossover in terms of framework and being able to identify the forms of abuse and the language that we're using doesn't often quite reach the places that it's needed to be. And particularly, I talk about things like harm, certainly echoing what Mike and both Matt have identified, that the way in which we elevate the situation is by the language that we're using on the day. And so in my role of working with survivors who had endured abuse inside our institutions, church faith-based institutions, I was able to connect with those who had suffered under conversion practices, and listen to their voices and listen to the concerns raised by my informed lived experience colleagues here on the day. And so I want to mihi to them for providing the korowai of atawhai, being able to support in depth the experiences of our queer whānau, takatapuhi whānau, and just to commend them. For the church, as I introduced earlier, the church really are working hard to, and I say this with hand over heart. I know many of my colleagues, particularly in the clergy area, who have worked hard to create safe spaces and communities of knowledge and support and care and compassion, which leads to the support that faith-based communities are involved in as we speak. And as I introduced earlier, we have a long way to go still. And it's information that's being provided by this report that has the convincing arguments where people might be in doubt, who's sitting with a wanga, unsure about what are some of the things that, what can we do as a faith-based community to provide support and to signal our allyship, really, and to say, I guess, that I think about things like, what can we do? What can we do? What does our call of action look like? I want to say that being here present today is part of that call to action, is to be the visible sign, is to be the voice, to be one voice out of many. I don't sit here speaking on behalf of all faith-based. I represent a portion of the community of faith-based and can speak into that space. I concur with the thoughts shared by my colleagues around how we create the central connect point or pipeline. I want us to endorse, and it certainly will be my messaging thereafter this hui today, will be to be an active voice. Not to be a silent ally or silent support sitting in the pew, but to grow their confidence, to address and to pull people up, essentially, to find the courage, to find the support systems to help us. I as I said, endorse the pipeline corridor that Michael speaks of, and looking at how to further develop. I certainly want to signal my ongoing support as the Commissary for the Anglican Church to look at ways in which we can develop and create educational programs. There's a small group of us who currently are involved. I know that there are some parishes in our communities. There are ecumenical bodies who are also very supportive, and to create that support and advocacy for survivors. One of our big worries, and I'm sure this occurs in many of our particularly urban and upcoming rural areas, is the situation around homelessness. We have a responsibility, ngā mātou ke te he. This is a situation created. It didn't belong to our survivors. So homelessness, beneficiary entitlement, counselling, wouldn't it be lovely to see our churches that have a designated role for survivors, that had, were able to meet with survivors, visibility amongst our churches to say we are a safe place of help, compassion, and listening listening with the tools of action. So I guess what would be a call to action, it would be to create these communities inside our parishes, inside our faith-based communities. I'm sure those of you who are listening today who are coming from the faith-based, I encourage us to get together. I encourage us to build these communities to ensure that we build those bodies of knowledge so that our whānau takatāpui, queer whānau, know who we are. Let's be visible, is probably my message today. In whatever communities we represent across the board. Nō reira, tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koe. Kia ora, Hera. Thank you so much for your wonderful sharings and learnings in terms of your work, and then also while you only represent, one portion of the Christian faith community, for embracing this conversation today, for being part of this conversation, to allow us to have a constructive conversation to look at what some settings are doing in order to address the realities of what this report talks about, and that is the conversion practices that leads to religious and spiritual abuse and harm as well. So we acknowledge that. I think one of the other interesting things within this world of survivor of conversion practices is that, as the research has shown, there of course are many people that would not want to associate themselves with a faith or religious identity in light of that spiritual and religious abuse that has harmed them. And yet, for other quarters of the survivor community, they also see that faith has been a continuous form of well-being and support for themselves. And I think of myself as a ex-pastor, but also a Samoan in many of our cultures, whereby faith and culture are inextricably linked. And due to the, I suppose, societal environments and when we grow up, where some communities experience marginalisation, that in fact the church was there for them when others weren't. And so you find the conversion practices survivor in that nexus of having to decide what support they will go to. And so these are the sorts of important conversations and nuances that occur in this space. So again, we thank you, Hera. We've got less than 10 minutes now, and I want to thank each of our incredible panelists for your contributions, your heartfelt contributions to our kōrero and our discussion today. We're not over. We've got time for probably at least one question per panelist. And we're going to kick off with you, Dr. Roguski, Michael, and there are some lovely comments coming in from our from those who are joining us today as well. But Michael, we'll kick off with you. It's been noted by others, but I will note again, and perhaps you can explain for us, what is the significance of the research that you've undertaken here when compared to other research in this space?
So, great question. So internationally, until now, pretty much all the research is focused on two things. One is the harm associated with conversion practices, and the other is prevalence. And that focus has been because the various jurisdictions have needed evidence to argue about the harm and how many people are affected by the harms to bring in legislation to criminalise the actions. So because New Zealand, we thankfully have since 2022 have the legislation, we're now in a place to be able to look at what type of support people need. And what's really cool, I think, about this research is that there are still so many jurisdictions who need to grapple with this, like the UK is going through it at the moment, some parts of Australia. And so this, rather than simply developing legislation around the actual harms, the abuse itself, this research, thanks to our participants, really highlights that, yes, we need to appreciate that this is extremely damaging, but we need support at the same time. So, yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora, Michael. I think that's really important. I think for so long, the voices of those who experiences these practices has felt very invisible. They felt that they had to defend and really explain that these practices did indeed harm them. And because of that, we have seen research that is sort of talking about the prevalence or what happens, but little research in terms of the recovery and what is required. So thank you for this unique contribution that you add into the literature there. But I think what you also show is that that the support needed is really wide there, and that pipeline of care is needed. It's a systems approach, and all of society approach, but many actors are needed to help people out of these practices. Matt, we'll go over to you for a question for you, and you kindly use your time to talk about sort of from a systems perspective, I suppose, and a wider perspective, what's happening for conversion practices survivors. If I can just change gears for a moment, and you're a survivor yourself, as you read the research, are there particular things that sort of resonate with you? And also, what do you think would have been most helpful for you to exit these practices in light of the research?
Yeah, lots of things in this research resonated with me, and I think that is an important point for us to sort of pause and recognize that survivors, because they have been kept from being who they are, live in a state of a lack of self-confidence, a lack of self-understanding, with a lot of shame, and with this constant sense of failure. We are stuck in a system that has become obsessed with our sexuality. So this is bizarre. Why is this? But that's what it is. And we can't change our sexuality. So every day, all parts of this system that we're in are a reminder that we are failing. And the importance of spiritual abuse having happened to us, being validated by peer-reviewed research like this, can't be understated, because the system makes us doubt ourselves and what we're thinking. And it makes us question, is it really that bad? Is this really what's happening? And we have now more evidence to say, yes, it is. It is happening to you, and it is bad. And it's one of the things that I would highlight in the system of support. If you find yourself supporting a survivor, one of the most important things you can do is just continually reassure this person that what you sense in your gut is right. It was not safe. It was not okay to try to be changed. And we need encouragement to listen to our guts and our inner voice. And we need support to go through the adolescence we never had, to engage with aspects of queer culture that we were blocked from, to test the waters in queer dating that we were never able to. And so a person having patience with us and supporting us as we make those first steps out is really important. And the last thing I would say is specifically to counselors and psychologists who find themselves supporting survivors. Thank you so much for the work that you do to bring us away from the abuse we went through. And can I ask on behalf of survivors that you're very mindful that the methods you use, good evidence-based sound methods, may inadvertently echo or mirror methods that were used as mechanisms of conversion practice. So what do I mean by that? Conversion practices misuse legitimate techniques to try to change and suppress people. And so you may find, if you're supporting a survivor in your practice, that they really struggle and are triggered by your valid techniques. And what that means is you must change your technique. Listen to your survivor and follow their lead, and find a way of just being with them and supporting them and encouraging them to find their voice. Find a way of doing that that does not mirror the techniques that were used on them during conversion practices.
Kia ora, Matt. Thank you so much. And, I think we hear words like naivety within the research and sort of this delayed socialization. And I absolutely relate to all of these. I won't share all my embarrassing stories, but I remember as a 40-plus-year-old dating for the first time in the gay world, and because of my previous vocation as a pastor, and because of my love for God, that in a date, it was very common for me to raise that I'd love Jesus. And I learnt before long that in the dating scene, that's a red flag, but it's little examples like that I think many of us, if you've grown up in a system of indoctrination, if that has become an all-encompassing, all-inclusive world, and that is your world, that your terms of reference and your frames of reference are actually quite different to perhaps other people your age in a similar situation. So thank you for this important research. Hera, we'll go over to you. You've used your comments so generously to sort of describe and to take ownership from, at least from your denomination's perspective, about the harm that has occurred to members of rainbow community and rainbow communities at large and other communities. The journey that you're on now in your church, as you acknowledge, is a long way to go, but you've started. What's your advice to other churches who are hearing about this research that we're engaging today and need the starting point, and also being cognizant that perhaps not everyone within the denomination is at the same place? Would you be able to briefly give us some advice or some encouragement to those people?
Sure. Kia ora, Andre. I guess my first kind of response to that would be to embrace the learnings from within the report. There are some profound examples of where we, the faith-based communities, can be instrumental. And I think what comes off that really is what that support looks like. We currently, as many faith-based organisations, we're there to help and to work alongside, to support, advocate those who have suffered. And I talked about the historical abuse in faith-based institutes. But we're there to help the homeless. We're there to be the advocates for the beneficiaries. We're there to lift up and elevate opportunities that enhance a thriving life ahead. So I would, my encouragement, I guess, is about building faith-based confidence. The report shows us, and I can't wait for the next one. And as you well know, inside the family violence, sexual harm, mahi and kaupapa, there's so much information out there. And for Michael's report, Michael and Nicola, well, aroha mai, Nicola, there's specific, I mean, this is the voice again. Once again, we're relying on the lived voice to inform what it's going to look like for us going forward. And let's not be afraid of that. Let's embrace the opportunities that are there for us lived. And having interviewed over, nearly 300 voices of those who have endured abuse in faith-based care, I just marvel at the opportunity to be able to write something as eloquent as this. Probably won't happen in my lifetime, but academics like Michael and the experiences that Matt shared earlier, I just think these lived experience voices deserve to be listened to, and that helps to inform our call to action for change. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora tātou. Kia ora, Hera. Can I encourage you to have some faith-based confidence that, in fact, I think you're going to issue a wonderful report from the incredible mahi that you do there as well. And I love that term, a wonderful term, faith-based confidence. And as an ex-pastor myself, I would love religious settings to have embraced that faith-based confidence to engage this very, very important kaupapa and hear what we're hearing about today, to hear it and respond to it meaningfully, not in a defensive way, but in a way that is going to take ownership and be reminded of why these places exist in the first place. We're going to finish up now, just a couple of reflections from me. Michael, thank you again. Thank you to our panelists, Hera and Matt, for your contributions today. Michael, we thank you and Nicola for this really incredible research, which has been downloaded a number of times, I understand already, which is excellent. I think this type of research will have resonance not only with survivors themselves, but for other people that want to support. Also note, unfortunately, but fortunately as well, that it is time for religious settings to also take heed and learn from this rather than to ignore this. There's a conference down south later this year in Te called Decult, and some of the calls that they call for is also for religious settings to also create these pipelines of care. So hopefully, Michael, you should be at that conference down there. I think the types of things that you're talking about in terms of a pipeline of care, in terms of a dedicated agency, in terms of the onus not being on survivors of religious abuse to extricate themselves, all these things are needed. And unfortunately, conversion practices survivors are only one cohort of where this harm can occur, and including religious settings. More importantly, I also just want to acknowledge the work here, but also a forthcoming work from the Human Rights Commission. Right now, if you go to the website tikatangata.org.nz, you can download a whole bunch of resources, a suite of resources, including guidance for faith settings, for healthcare settings, for youth settings, and other places to ensure that they learn about the legislation and do not practice conversion practices at all. But forthcoming is going to be a Conversion Practices Insights report, and that report will take the voices of survivors and the insights that they've said. It is going to be uniquely New Zealand, and it will have also a flavour that addresses Takatapu Māori, Pacific, ethnic voices, as well as, rather than today, we've only been talking about religious settings, but we'll expand as well to healthcare settings, and we'll also look at the experience of trans and non-binary as well. So look out for that. Thank you everyone for your time here today, for joining us on your lunch. It has been a real privilege to facilitate this wonderful kōrero between the three people that you see on the screen. From wherever you are, please join me in thanking them for their contribution, not only to our panel today, but for their wisdom and their work that they do here and throughout. So that's the end of our time. I did see a hand raised. No, some hearts there. Thank you. There's information there on the screen. Again, please check out the website there for information and other resources. If you believe you have experienced conversion practices, please make a complaint there or to the inquiries team at Te Kāhui Tika Tangata as well. And of course, if you found any of the information today as upsetting or distressing, there are support services available there for you. Thank you as well, just to acknowledge the team. Thank you to NZSL interpreters and a wonderful team at Te Kāhui Tika Tangata behind the scenes that have made today possible. Thank you, everyone. Take care and go well. Ka kite.